for joining us today. We're really excited. I mean, this is our second to last class, so a little bittersweet, but today we're really excited to be talking about some concepts that are kind of new because before we had really been talking about does someone want to explain what did we talk about before in the past couple of weeks? You can even go as early as the first week. Anyone want to jump in? You can say in the chat too. Does anyone remember what was the first kind of topic that we covered? Or even what did we do last week?
We did what were viruses, what's the immune system, and a guest presentation with 2 doctors from Stanford.
Yes, thank you, Atasi. That was like the first thing that we did for the program. And can someone tell me what did we do last week? Or what was just the main concept? The Russian thing? Oh, environmental factors. Thank you, Rithwik. What was the Russian thing? I don't remember. But yes, we talked about global warming, how that affects how the environment affects health, and that's really important. So today, what we're going to be talking about is we're actually going to be talking about political science and how political science relates to pandemics. So the main topics that we're going to be talking about are kind of governmental agencies involved with the pandemic, school reopenings. We're going to have a fun debate about that, and I'm really excited to hear everyone's thoughts. And then we have a guest presentation from Dr. Fowler, who's a professor of public policy at the University of Chicago, and he does a lot of research about elections and voting and how that's going to look in a world where we have something like the pandemic. So the first thing that I wanted to ask everyone is just kind of a simple question in that, other than the concepts of health in our body, how do we think the pandemic affects us or affects kind of our daily lives? And feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or you can always type in the chat.
Taking away jobs, slowing the economy, and a few other things.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. So jobs, the economy, those are some really important things that oftentimes people don't think about because they just think about kind of the health aspect or kind of people's lives. So that's a great point. What are some other things? Some other things that we just talked this before we started the call, but kind of how has the pandemic affected our lives, especially as students, because all of us are students. It's not too hard. I'm sure y'all can answer this question.
I wasn't paying attention. Wait, what did you say?
I was saying, what are some other ways that the pandemic affects our lives outside of just health? Thank you, Vivian. Yeah, online school, the environment. Okay, let's see if everyone's awake. Can everyone just give me a thumbs up or a reaction just so I can see that everyone's paying attention? Okay, amazing. I'm seeing them pop on my screen, so that's good. So let's think. What are some other things? Yeah, and feel free to turn on your camera if you want to as well. But what are some other ways that the pandemic affects our lives? Not just kind of health or vaccines, but other things. I can get the conversation started. Think about people who there's food insecurity. For example, there are lots of people who maybe rely on free lunches at school. So now that schools are shut down, they need to figure out where they need to get their food from. And Vivian mentioned in the chat, there's less eating out. That's also really important. We don't see many people being able to go to restaurants because restaurants are shut down. Gyms are shut down. So, okay, I think those are some good ideas to get us started. So then, and Vivian mentioned toilet paper. Yes, that is a huge deal as well. So kind of now that we know that, here's a question that I want all of us to think about, which is, in what ways is the government involved with pandemic and disease response? So you can take a couple of seconds to look at this question, but now that we understand different ways in which the pandemic affects our lives, what are different ways that the government can then step in, sort of control the pandemic spread, and then also ensure that we are not affected as much? So I'm going to leave this slide up for a second.
So I think that the government can stop the pandemic by having quarantine and providing face masks. They can do more extreme measures, but That hasn't happened in decades.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for that. So definitely the government can kind of enact certain policies and maybe not kind of the overall federal government, so from the White House, but maybe like our local governments or our state governments can do things like you need to stay at home. So for example, in California, they were stay at home orders that for, I mean, I don't remember how long it was, but it was, I think, around a month or so where you had to stay at home and you couldn't leave your houses unless there was some like a really important need. So yeah, quarantining, also mandating face masks when you go outside. Like the governor of California has said, please wear face masks whenever you go outside just to limit the spread. So yes, that's a great example of how the government is involved. What are some other kind of things that you think the government does or can do to help those affected by the pandemic? Akshara mentioned the government can tell things that are already on the news. So for example, wear masks, stay like 6 feet away. Rithwik mentioned a really cool one. So they're increasing funding to vaccine research. That's a really important thing. Oftentimes that these vaccines are funded by the government. So this is a really cool way of being able to kind of increase funding so we can get a cure in the end. Vivian mentioned stimulus checks. That's a huge thing. I know Andrew mentioned this at the beginning of class, but sometimes because the economy is doing so poorly, like it is doing now, with so many shops, so many restaurants, so many places shut down, stimulus checks are a good way of ensuring that people can still afford everyday basic necessities. So that's important. How about we take one more? It doesn't need to be super well thought out, and no idea is a bad idea, but what do you think the government can do or should do? How about I can give you guys a clue. So for example, so Vivian mentioned they can spread awareness, Rithwik mentioned they can increase testing. Those are some great examples. So I think that those definitely are important things that the government can do. And with that, we just kind of wanted to go through different ways. And these are like the major ways that stood out to Ryan and I about how the government can be involved with the pandemic. So for example, at the top, we can see that this is the government over here. And these are different ways in which kind of the government can control different parts of kind of pandemic response. So the first thing we can see is think of this little symbol as medicine. So we can see that the government is basically going to kind of like we have agencies like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. We have the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is actually funding a vaccine project right now. We have the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates vaccines. So these are some really important agencies. And I think that these are the most common agencies that we often hear about in the news, just because they're so involved with health. So I think that those are ones that we kind of obviously know about. But what about the Department of Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Services? Can anyone take it as to kind of what do you think the Department of Agriculture is doing?
Controls farming.
Yeah, so the Department of Agriculture is very involved with, they work with farmers, they figure out food supply. And something specific in the case of the coronavirus is, like I mentioned before, lots of students rely on free lunches when they go to school. So when schools are shut down, the Department of Agriculture, specifically the Food and Nutrition services, figured out a way of partnering up with states to make sure students still get food. And they also have found a way to make SNAP benefits, or for people who maybe aren't able to afford food and kind of use benefits from the government, they figured out a way to make these benefits online so they could still use them in kind of a virtual coronavirus setting. So that's super important. And also, I personally cannot see the chat. So Ryan, if someone has any questions or answers, please feel free to read them aloud.
Yeah.
But what do we think Customs and Border Control does? And even if you don't know exactly what this agency does, try to take a clue from the pictures and the icons.
It controls the border and makes sure no immigrants that are illegally come.
So Customs and Border Control is definitely involved with kind of overall border control in general. And specifically in the case of the coronavirus, they basically set out travel restrictions. And they said that based on places that have really high kind of cases of coronavirus, they recommend that people don't travel there. And they also say people traveling from there, they kind of increase regulations to make sure the spread doesn't come to the United States. So yes, that's exactly what they're doing. And small business administration. So I think Andrew mentioned a little bit of this, so I can kind of re-explain it. But a lot of small businesses are struggling just because they don't have as much business. People are not going out of their houses to buy as much items. So they're kind of struggling compared to big companies. So because of that, the government gave loans to these small businesses saying, we will give you these loans to stay afloat, and hopefully this way they don't fire anybody, because small businesses employ so many people that the government didn't want all these employees to then kind of lose their jobs. So this is a super easy one, the Department of Education. What do we think the Department of Education does in a pandemic? Like, what do you think their role is going to be?
Figuring out how to teach students like online school and when to reopen.
Exactly, that's exactly it. Figuring out kind of the guidelines to reopening, should schools reopen, and also how online schooling will work. An important thing to keep in mind, though, is that the Department of Education cannot force schools to reopen. It's really up to the state government as well as those local governments to make a decision as to whether or not, based on the cases in that area, those schools should reopen. And finally, we've got the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So what do we think the Department of Housing and Urban Development is doing, specifically in the case of the pandemic?
I think that they're helping the situation in urban housing, because when the pandemic strikes, there's going to be a lot of things happening with houses. Like, actually, I'm not that sure though. Aren't they responsible for dealing with keeping people quarantined?
So the thing that the Department of Housing often does is they figure out kind of guidelines for public housing to make sure that they're safe and they prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Also for people who are maybe homeless or displaced and don't have a home, how do we house them? Because oftentimes those who are homeless don't have access to sanitation, which makes it really easy for them to get the crisis. And also kind of something that the Department of Housing did is that for people who maybe weren't able to afford their rents, they told landlords to kind of forgive them for a little bit just because the situation was so different. So kind of those are just a couple of agencies that we wanted to bring about, because yes, those like the CDC, kind of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration, those are important agencies, but they are not the only agencies that are kind of trying to figure out what to do given the coronavirus. So the big picture takeaway we want you guys to kind of understand from this is just that at the end of the day, our government is involved in kind of every aspect of the pandemic response, meaning that politics and political science is really, really important to understand, because yes, we can understand the science of a vaccine. We can figure out that, okay, this is how it spreads. This is the kind of vaccine that would help target it. This is where the virus came from. But if we don't work with the government to figure out ways to bring this knowledge to the everyday person, kind of create policies that are science-backed, then there is no way that people actually benefit from this information. So if you're interested in political science, if you're interested in government, there is still a way for you to bring your love for science into that. So for example, Ryan and I both did debate all throughout high school because we really liked political science and we really liked learning government. So, and we still love science, and I think science for both Ryan and I, like that's what we want to go into. We want to go into medicine, but that doesn't mean that you can ignore kind of political science, which is why we wanted to have a lesson about it, even though it doesn't seem like the most scientific thing out there. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Oh, and Rithika mentioned if the local government decides if a school should reopen, then what does the Department of Education do? That's a really good question, and I can get back to you with a lot more specifics. But because of this thing called federalism, it means that the state government and these local governments have a lot more power in determining what they specifically do, what they will specifically do with their own kind of schools, just because the number of cases vary so much from place to place that it's really hard to create a blanket policy, say every school should reopen, every school should stay closed, which is why it's really dependent on the region. But that's a really good question. Okay.
Can they make like guidelines saying that if you have more than 100,000 cases in your state, you have to close schools? Can they do something like that?
That's a good question, and honestly, I can look into it. I'm sure that they are creating guidelines of some sort to do something like that. I don't know what their specific guidelines are yet, but that's a good question, and we can look into it.
Okay.
Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is, now that we kind of have an understanding of what, government agencies are doing to tackle the pandemic, wanted to simulate being a government agency and kind of debating some of the things that we need to do to address the pandemic. So because school reopening is a topic that all of us kind of know about, all of us are really involved with, and it's personal to us, we thought we would do a debate on whether or not schools should be reopened. And to make it a little bit more specific, we're going to pick the city of Los Angeles, just because it's hard to say whether or not like every school in the country should reopen. That's hard. But we think that it's a cool idea to focus on specifically one city and kind of look at the cases in that one city. So kind of with that, we're going to make 2 breakout rooms. And in these breakout rooms, if Ryan is in your breakout room, well, hopefully it'll assign us correctly such that Ryan and I are in 2 separate breakout rooms. But I'm just going to create the breakout rooms in a second. But basically, if you're in Ryan's breakout room, you're going to be figuring out the cons to reopening. So why we shouldn't reopen schools. And if you're with me, then we'll be talking about why we should reopen schools. And so we're basically just going to have like kind of a discussion amongst ourselves for 5 minutes. We did this like a couple of sessions ago, and then we're going to come back together in a big group, figure out, do we have an agreement? And at the end of these 5 minutes, I also want us to be as specific as possible. So it shouldn't just be like, oh, we should reopen schools because of this. It should be, with all the reasons we said, we think that this is a policy that should be placed. So try to make it as specific as possible. And even if that's confusing, Brian and I can explain. So we're going to create the breakout rooms right now. So you should, let's see.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us today. So we're on the side of why schools shouldn't reopen in LA. And we have 5 minutes to discuss different reasons why we think it's unsafe to open schools. So I can take notes on what everyone wants to input. And yeah, so does anyone have any opening thoughts about why they think schools should not open?
Los Angeles has like a lot of cases.
So Los Angeles has a lot of cases. Okay. And I think someone in the chat says everyone who goes to school will get infected, then their parents will get infected. So what do you think is it about schools that makes them so dangerous? Like why, if like people are constantly at risk of getting coronavirus, as long as you're seeing
They're at huge risk because the city is very densely populated, millions of people for a few schools. It'll be like a perfect breeding ground for the coronavirus. So the public schools in Los Angeles would be horrible. Instead, we should do something else besides reopening physical schools.
Okay. So we know Los Angeles is pretty densely populated, but what do you think are things specific to schools that make them a little more dangerous?
They're very dense.
Schools are very dense.
Yeah, they have like over 1,000 people, and like say on the lunch tables, like no one's 6 feet away from each other.
Okay, so like eating is going to be an issue. Some schools are pretty small, so they won't be able to spread everyone 6 feet apart.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm correct about this, but you know how there's those aid groups that give out free breakfast and lunches at schools?
Yeah.
I think that they're very popular in Los Angeles. Am I correct?
I'm not from Los Angeles, so I'm not sure, but I do think there are a lot of schools there that do provide
My point is that
qualify.
it would be very crowded when in the lunch line. There'd be like hundreds of people waiting for a hot lunch in the same line, and then the potential for the coronavirus to spread is immense.
Mm-hmm.
Also, in such a big city, there is just not enough masks to go around, so you can see how fast it could spread.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So I think we're all in agreement here that also, do you think, what do people think? Like, do you think students will be pretty good about wearing masks? Or
No,
No.
not at all.
No, but
Once I went to once I was looking at a restaurant's entrance, I saw like a bunch of kids running out without masks. I was like, what are you guys doing? You have to wear masks in restaurants.
exactly. Okay, so
no, but also you can't eat while you're wearing a mask. So let people like take them off.
so now that I think we're all in agreement that schools are a pretty bad environment for coronavirus, what do you think should be the alternative? I know some people are doing online school.
Online school.
And
I
what do
also
you,
have another.
and what do you think are, so I know you guys have briefly experienced online school. Can you guys just like tell me some ideas about how you think it can be improved?
I think I have another idea. Like maybe you
Yeah.
only send like a fourth of or a fifth of the school to school on Monday and
Mhm.
have them online school on the other 4 days, and like do that for like each group, like make multiple groups.
Yeah, I think some private schools are considering doing that in the Bay Area. What do people think about that idea before we hop back into the main room?
That's
I
good.
have another reason why they shouldn't
There
open.
might be. I have a point that might collapse that idea.
Yeah.
It's a good idea and all, but how do people afford the cost of all those computers and things like that?
Oh, some students don't have access to computers.
Isn't there like free Chromebooks? Sorry, my bad.
Free Chromebooks. I think some schools in LA
In some
don't
schools.
have
Yeah,
access.
but the Chromebooks might be infected.
Okay, so Chromebooks might also be contaminated too. So how about, do you think schools should only let students who can't afford technology at home come back onto campus?
Yeah,
You
that
think
might
that's
be a good idea.
solution?
Yeah.
But then how do they know that a student doesn't have technology at home? Some students might just come.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. But I think so my university, for example, has sent out surveys to students about whether or not they have Wi-Fi at home or if they have computer access. So maybe that's something Los Angeles can consider doing to see if students
They could lie on the survey.
they can lie on the survey. That's true, but hopefully there's
A
a
lot
way.
of people won't lie. A lot of
Yeah,
people won't lie.
I think
And how will they give out the survey? Because would it be online survey? Would they
Probably
give you the paper?
email.
yeah,
Just
probably
email.
email. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to return back to the main session. This is a great brainstorming session, and hopefully we can win this mini debate. Okay. See you guys in the main session. Is everyone?
Okay,
Oh,
I think people are still coming back, but I think we're on track, so that's good. I know that our guest speaker, Dr. Fowler, is supposed to speak in any minute, but Ryan, do you maybe want to summarize what your group came up with? And then I can summarize what my group came up with.
so we first discussed that Los Angeles is super densely populated and schools are just not safe to reopen because a lot of students mentioned that there's very dense, and especially when you're eating, you can't wear a mask, and there's probably just not enough masks for students, and students won't be that good about wearing masks. So one alternative that we thought of was we want to do online school, but because we understand that most students can't, sorry, not most, but some students don't have access to technology at home, then we should allow those students to return to campus so that they could still enjoy an education.
Yeah, those are some really great ideas. And I think it's kind of cool because our group also came to a very similar kind of consensus in that we should try to make it optional, because for students who don't have access to stable Wi-Fi, or students who maybe are younger and can't learn in an online environment, we should let them go back to school such that there are not as many students and make it optional. So I think that that was something that we also kind of came to an agreement of. So it's really cool to see that we both settled on some middle ground without having to do a lot of work about it. But yes, Thank you guys for engaging in that activity. That's really exciting to hear everyone's thoughts. Now we're going to have our guest speaker, Dr. Fowler, kind of give his insights about the intersection between political science and elections. So can everyone give him a really warm welcome?
Thank you, Dr. Fowler.
Hi.
Hi everyone. It's good to talk to all of you. I was told not to do anything too fancy, not to show too many slides or equations or anything like that. So I'm going to try not to do that, but I will show you a few things that might be of interest. I'm happy for this to be a pretty free-flowing conversation. So please go ahead and just interrupt me if you have a question or if there's something you want to talk about. I was told to talk about something related to the intersection of COVID-19 and elections, and so I can talk a little bit about that. But if you have any specific questions you have or things you want to talk about, I'm happy to change course. So I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. I teach in the public policy school there. My background is in political science. I have a PhD in political science, and I primarily do data science. I collect big data sets and try to make sense of them, and I try to think of clever ways to use observational data to answer interesting, important questions. Often these are causal questions like, what would happen if everybody voted? Or what would happen if more people use vote by mail? Or what would happen if we implemented the following political reforms? How well is political representation working? Those kinds of things. So I'm trying to use data to answer those kinds of questions as best as I can. I don't know a lot about your group, but from what I do know, it sounds like a really interesting and important and valuable thing that you guys are doing. So I really applaud you for getting together and having these conversations. I can tell you that when I was in high school, I don't think I knew anything about how academia really worked. I mean, I was a good student and I worked hard in school and I wanted to go to a good college, but I don't think I really had a good sense of any of these kind of broader, important scientific questions that you guys are talking about. I had a great biology teacher who took me. I grew up in San Diego, and my biology teacher took me to visit the Salk Institute, which is a independent research organization that does lots of biological. Maybe you guys already know about it. I didn't know anything about this, and we got to meet scientists and we got to hear talks from them, and we got to hear about what are they working on, and I heard about Sidney Brenner and Rob Horowitz, these guys who decided we're going to study the little C. elegans worms, and we're going to trace the history of every cell in the C. elegans worm and figure out what does every cell do and what does its development look like and what do all the genes do. And I don't think I knew anything about what scientific research looked like until that day. And I left that meeting. That was kind of maybe my sophomore year of high school. And I left that day thinking, I didn't even know that was a career option, that you could just be a scientist and you could sit in your lab and you could work on scientific questions without even having a sense of whether there was going to be a commercial application or anything. You could just work, you could just try to answer important scientific questions, and somebody might pay you to do that. And my parents worked in the restaurant industry and they didn't know much about that world. And I kind of decided from them that I wanted to be like a scientist. I wanted to be a researcher. And I just thought that was really cool. I also don't think I even knew that, I think I was in college and I really wanted to get a PhD and wanted to go to graduate school, but I kind of thought I probably can't afford to go to graduate school. And it turns out, I didn't know this, maybe some of you know this, but if you get into a good PhD program, they will usually pay you to go to the PhD program. They will, you don't have to pay tuition, and they'll actually give you a stipend, and it's reasonably generous stipend for if you're a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, you can live on it. And so, if you do want to go that route, I know some of you are really interested in science and research and so on. So if you do want to go that route, that is a very viable option that when I was at your stage, I didn't even know that was something that was available to me. And I only learned later in college that I can in fact go to graduate school. And then of course after I finished graduate school, I applied for jobs all around the country and became a professor and was really fortunate to end up in Chicago. But I hope you guys are way ahead of where I was in the sense of you're already learning a lot about science and you're learning a lot about academia and research and how these fields work. And I hope you're taking advantage of a lot of opportunities that are available to you because that's really exciting. So I can talk a little about what I do, and we can talk a little about COVID-19 and elections. Why don't I show you, instead of showing you any slides or anything, why don't I just show you a little bit of what my computer screen looks like when I actually collect and analyze data. because most of what I do is actually, sitting, usually it's in my office. Right now I'm at home, but usually I'm sitting in my office and looking at my computer screen and trying to make sense of complicated political data or social data or something like that. And you can just get a sense of what that even looks like and maybe what your appetite to decide if this is something that interests you. I suspect that most of the talks that you get are from scientists and not from social scientists. And maybe you haven't seen a lot of, like big data kinds of projects. I don't know. So, so let me briefly just share my screen and show you a couple fun things, right? Or at least some things that I hope will be fun. So this is what my screen might look like if I was going to do some data analysis. I'm going to open up a program called Stata. I don't know if any of you have heard of Stata before, but it is a statistical software program. There are lots of them out there. Stata is one that you have to pay for, so you can't just download Stata. But there's another program called R, which is pretty popular as well, and that one's free. And so if any of you are kind of inclined toward programming, you can just go download R. You can start playing around with data. There are other ones like SPSS and SAS and Gauss and so on. They all do similar kinds of things. But typically with one of these software programs, you will have, here, let me get rid of it. You will have, so I can't see you anymore. So just go ahead and speak up if you have a question and interrupt me. You'll have some code, and then you'll have some window over here that might give you some output of that code. And here, this is some code that I have written that will allow me to scrape data from the Johns Hopkins COVID-19 GitHub. So this is the place where lots of public health officials are going to post their data to say how many cases, how many deaths in their locality on a given day, and so on. And so I've written a little bit of code to essentially just loop over that data to assemble it all. And obviously, you don't have to understand how all of this code works, but once you get a sense of how Stata works or any kind of programming language works, there are a lot of fun, exciting things you can do with it, and you can collect pretty large, often interesting data sets. So let me just show you. Maybe I won't, I won't go through every part of this, obviously. But in the end, what this produces, and I obviously can do lots of different things with this, but I'm reading in all of that data here. So it's updating me as it's doing each of these little steps, and it's doing some cleaning and organizing of data and fixing mistakes. And then in the end, this particular code gives me a data set that just tells me on every day in every state how many confirmed COVID cases were there at that time, and how many confirmed COVID deaths were there at that time. And this is cumulative, and so it's going to keep ticking up over time. So we see here we're looking at Alaska, just because this is alphabetical, and we're looking at the number of confirmed cases, the number of deaths in Alaska, and so on. And this is now a data set that I can work with, and I can do lots of interesting analyses with. And this is a fairly typical format you might see for a data set where, essentially this is a spreadsheet, right? So maybe some of you have used Excel, you've looked at, you've made charts before. Every row, I can think of every row in this data set as being a unit of observation. And then each of the columns, sometimes we'll call those variables or features of those observations that we want to do some analyses with those features. And so, these data sets can get very large. This one isn't huge. This one, the day here, you might have been mystified by this day thing. You just want a nice way of like coding days. And so this happens to be days after January 1st, 1960 or something like that. But you can obviously code up days however you want. But if I had written instead, March 10th, 2020, that wouldn't be very useful as data because there wouldn't be a number. So I've written it this other way. So let me show you some other data sets just to get a sense of the kinds of things you can do. This is a voter file from Wisconsin, and this is a very large data set because every row here now corresponds to an individual person, a registered voter in Wisconsin. So I'm not showing you any of their personal identifying information here, but you can see that for every registered voter here, I have what county they live in, what municipality, and so on. And I have a bunch of demographic information about their zip code. Do they live in a, what's the population of their zip code? how many people are over 65 in their zip code and so on. And then there's just a bunch of zeros and ones here that tell me, did this person vote by mail in a particular election? 1 if they voted by mail, 0 if they didn't, and so on. So you can imagine lots of these variables that you want to collect for each individual person. And this is a big data set. We can just scroll down to the bottom, and you have something like, what is it, 3.2 million rows in this data set. And I'm not using any fancy computer here. I'm just using a pretty standard laptop, and I can relatively easily do lots of interesting things with even these pretty large data sets. So again, we don't have to go into all the technical details, but I can show you some of the kinds of things you can do with these large data sets. Some of the kinds of analyses you can do. This isn't going to be a lecture on econometrics or anything, but when you're in college, you should go ahead and take those classes and learn all about how to do cool things with data. But let me show you a few of the things that I have done. So one project I've been working on, and I'll just show you this graph for now. One project I've been working on that involves a bunch of students from the University of Chicago. We've been collecting data on COVID-19. And we've been particularly interested in government responses to COVID-19. So when states and counties implement shelter-in-place policies, for example, we've been keeping track of all of those dates. When were these policies in place? And one of the questions we've tried to answer is, what are the effects of these policies? Do shelter-in-place policies or stay-at-home orders actually mitigate COVID-19? And we can talk about some of the ways we've tried to do that. We essentially have used the kinds of data sets that I showed you a moment ago, like whereas every observation might be a state day, and we're looking at the number of cases, number of deaths, and so on. And then we can try to use some different empirical strategies to try to account for nationwide trends. We can try to account for differences between states and so on. We can try to account for previous patterns of COVID in those states, and we essentially running what we call regressions. If you haven't already, you will probably take a class in college where you have to learn about and use linear regression or some version of regression. So we're running a bunch of regressions, and we're trying to learn about the effect of shelter-in-place policies. Do they actually do what people think they should do? And what you're seeing here is a picture. You might think of this as an event study where we're essentially estimating what's the effect of having a shelter-in-place policy after 0 days, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and so on. So we're essentially saying, what's the cumulative effect of having a shelter-in-place policy over a particular period of time? And the answer seems to be, there's not a whole lot, actually. These shelter-in-place policies actually are not as effective, at least as far as we can tell, as you might think just from reading the news, or as you might hope if you were one of these governments implementing these policies. So if you take a look at this mobility graph here we're estimating, is there an effect? Do people seem to comply with the shelter-in-place policies? Do people actually reduce their mobility? So we have a bunch of data from GPS devices where we have people's smartphones, and we can see how many miles are they driving every day, how many people are leaving home, and we can try to see, does implementing a shelter-in-place policy actually reduce mobility? And the answer to that is yes. These shelter-in-place policies do reduce mobility, but it's not by a whole lot. It's by something like 1 or 2%. And it turns out this effect essentially goes away after maybe 8, 9, 10 days. So once a state has already had a shelter-in-place policy in place for 8 or 9 days, it's no longer working at keeping people at home. And perhaps because shelter-in-place policies aren't as effective as you might think in actually getting people to comply and stay at home, shelter-in-place policies also don't seem to have huge preventative effects on COVID cases or COVID deaths. These are COVID cases per million people. These are COVID deaths per million people. And if anything, these plots actually make it look like maybe shelter-in-place is actually hurting, although I think we should take those with a grain of salt. And then lastly, we're looking here at unemployment. Do shelter-in-place policies seem to increase unemployment? And the answer seems to be yes. It does look like after shelter-in-place policies have been in place for 1 or 2 weeks, there is higher unemployment. So, you can imagine that mayors and governors are facing a really difficult challenge here. They're trying to figure out how to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, but at the same time, a lot of people don't comply with these shelter-in-place orders, and therefore these shelter-in-place orders don't actually have big health effects, even though they seem to have adverse economic effects. So that's a fairly troubling result. maybe I should stop here because I've said a lot already and see if anybody has questions or wants to interject or disagree with me or anything like that. And again, I'm happy to sort of change course depending on your own questions and interests.
I have a question.
Yes.
So on the charts, it says that it seems to imply that the deaths are increasing as mobility increases, but then the cases weren't increasing in that space of time like as much. So I'm confused.
Okay, let's go back to that for a second. It's possible that we are over-interpreting small little fluctuations. So let me go back to sharing my screen here. So let me try to understand the point you're making. So you're talking about deaths sort of, if anything, kind of ticking up a little bit around the same time that mobility was kind of ticking up. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And then you're saying we're not seeing the same thing with cases, and so you're puzzled by that. That was right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is a little bit puzzling. There is probably not a proportional relationship between cases and deaths in the way you might expect, because as you know, the case numbers are so sensitive to the testing in place in a particular locality or state. So that could be one answer to the question. It could be that the deaths numbers are in some ways more reliable, but our estimates of the number of cases are less reliable because cases are so heavily influenced by how much testing we're doing. But it could also just be, maybe we shouldn't overinterpret small little fluctuations. I would mostly interpret these cases and deaths plots as essentially zeros. The red dots here suggest that there's a statistically significant effect. So there's an effect that's statistically distinguishable from zero, but there aren't very many of these red dots in these cases. And we can talk more about what that means, statistical significance. But I think mostly what you're seeing here is essentially a zero. And what you might have expected to see was a big negative effect. You might have expected to see that shelter in place would really decrease cases or decrease deaths, and we're not really seeing it. Are there other questions on anything so far? Okay. Well, so there's certainly more we can talk about. So we haven't talked very much about elections, which is my primary area of interest. I'm really interested in I'm really interested in both, who votes and to what extent does that matter. I'm interested in voting technology, so we can talk about that to some extent. And of course, COVID-19 has posed a whole host of interesting and important challenges for people who study elections, people who care about democracy, people who administer elections. And so there's a lot to talk about there. One thing I can show you is based on that Wisconsin data that I showed you. So I had the Wisconsin voter file. And one analysis I conducted with that data was to just essentially ask, let's try to predict which voters typically vote in elections, and let's see if COVID-19 appeared to deter participation in Wisconsin. So Wisconsin had their presidential primary election in early April, which was a pretty serious time where lots of people were really worried about COVID-19, and maybe a lot of people were not eager to go outside, wait in a long line, be in close proximity with a lot of other people. And so you might be especially worried that maybe COVID-19 deterred participation in Wisconsin in April. Furthermore, Wisconsin is not a very progressive state in terms of making it easy for people to vote by mail. You can vote by mail, but you have to request a mail ballot. You have to scan and send in an ID, because Wisconsin is a voter ID state. So it's not easy to get a mail ballot. And even if you get a mail ballot, you actually have to have a witness testify and say, someone else who's a registered voter has to essentially sign and say, I saw you fill out this ballot. I'm attesting that it was really you that filled out the ballot and not somebody else. And you can imagine that, suppose you live alone, or suppose you're a single parent or an elderly person, it might be very difficult for you and even risky for you to get a valid witness to sign your ballot. And so you could imagine that that was a case where maybe COVID-19 did really deter participation. And so I'll show you a few graphs. Let me share my screen again. I'll show you a few graphs of that. So one of the things I did with that data was I essentially, and we can talk about the details, but I looked at the prior turnout history of all of those 3.2 million registered voters, and I just tried to predict which of them were likely to vote in April 2020 based on their historical voting behavior. And then I essentially tried to calculate, here we're looking at residual turnout, which is just how much did you vote more or less than you would have otherwise expected. And I essentially calculated residual turnout for every voter, and then I can aggregate up to the county level, and I can ask, how much more or less did every county vote than you might have otherwise expected in the absence of COVID-19? And one thing you see here is that this residual turnout that I just talked about seems to be strongly negatively related to the prevalence of COVID-19 in that county. The reason we're looking at counties here is that this is essentially the smallest geographic unit for which we have good COVID-19 data. So we know how many COVID cases there were in every county on April 7th, the time of this election. And you can see that Milwaukee was by far the highest COVID prevalence county, and they also had notably lower participation than you would otherwise expect. Something like 4 or 5% lower participation in Milwaukee than you might have otherwise expected. And then you can dig into that a little bit further and you can ask, okay, within places in Milwaukee, do you see lower turnout in the places that you might expect if it really was COVID-19 that was deterring participation? And so one of the things I looked at was zip codes. So here each circle is a zip code. And I'm looking at this residual turnout measure for every zip code. And I'm trying to see, was there a greater deterrent effect of COVID-19 or lower participation than you otherwise expect in places where more people rely on public transportation? And this, I thought, was at least just one proxy of how worried should somebody be about COVID-19. Obviously, if you live in the suburbs and you drive your car and you're driving to a big polling location and you don't have to interact with a lot of people, maybe that's relatively safer than if you live in a very urban area. You'd have to get on the bus to go to your polling place and so on. And so here's a simple analysis where I'm just checking to see, was turnout related to public transportation use in this election? And it looks like, yes, it looks like there's a very strong negative relationship here, again, with the strongest sort of deterrent effect of COVID-19 in the places where you might expect people to be most worried about COVID-19. And the risks of voting are the highest. And so these are the kinds of analyses you can do. And again, there's lots of other things we could have looked at here, but even with publicly available data, this is a reasonably interesting way, I think, to try to figure out, was COVID-19 really having a deterrent effect, and do we need to do something about it come November? Let me stop there and see if there are more questions. Again, I don't want to show too many graphs or too many analyses.
Wait, in that graph, was the size of the circle the number of cases in that zip code?
The size of the circle was proportional to the number of residents in that zip code.
Okay.
The number of cases. Unfortunately, we don't actually have data on the number of COVID cases in the zip code. I think that would be interesting if we had it available, but almost all of the public health data gets reported only at the county level, not we couldn't get that data at the zip code level. But the size of the circles corresponds to how many people live in that zip code, since some zip codes are much more populous than others. And so you'd want to put more weight on the populous zip codes, presumably, when you're doing that analysis.
Okay.
I think a couple of students, Dr. Fowler, in the chat were talking about how kind of a lot of limitations brought up by COVID will discourage people from voting, just like your graphs were showing. So I think they were curious to see what you think policymakers might be doing to prepare for the November election.
Sure. Yeah, I think policymakers and election administrators are in a very difficult position for all the reasons you can imagine, which is people are nervous about going out to the polling places in person. Poll workers are probably nervous about doing that. And so I think policymakers should be pretty creative in thinking of ways to solve this problem. Vote by mail is one potential solution. There are already maybe 6 states that automatically send a mail ballot to every registered voter. And I think the more states that adopt that strategy, I think the better, at least in this current climate. So that's certainly one solution. And there is evidence out there that all mail elections do increase participation. It's not, in normal times, it's not a huge effect. It's on the order of 1 or 2 percentage points. But you can imagine that in the midst of a global pandemic, maybe that effect would be a lot larger and that would be really important. But I think even then, I think given some of the difficulties that some people have when they're voting by mail, I think you'd also want to think about other ways to try to make it easier for people to vote. So you'd want to have maybe more polling places, less crowded polling places, more stations in those polling places so people can spread out and people can vote safely. You also are going to want to think about the logistical challenges of having, say, more mail ballots than ever before. I think a lot of states, Illinois, where I live, is a state where voting by mail is an option, and has been an option for all voters without an excuse for a long time. But it was usually a relatively low rate of people that would take up voting by mail as the option. And now all of a sudden, you might very well have 80% of Illinois voters casting a ballot by mail all of a sudden. And so all of these little county election offices that have never dealt with thousands of mail ballots coming in are now going to have to deal with that. And so that logistical challenge is going to be pretty interesting and important. How do they store the ballots? God forbid, what if there's a security breach and some bad actor breaks into the election office and steals ballots or contaminates them or publishes a list of who voted for which candidate? You can imagine all kinds of disaster scenarios. And so I think the local election officials are going to have to work very hard to try to avoid those as much as possible. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. And, there are a lot of people talking about election hacking and cybersecurity, and I'm very interested in those questions as well. But probably the biggest threats are even the low-tech kinds of threats, right? I mean, just what if somebody broke through the door and tampered with a bunch of mail ballots? And even if that doesn't change the results of an election, what if it leads to a bunch of mistrust where a bunch of citizens, the people on the losing end of the election, are really upset and think that there was fraud or think that the election was stolen? That would obviously be a really troubling thing from the perspective of democracy. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there as well.
I think some people in the chat have been talking about voting online, and we were wondering if you can maybe speak about your insights about online voting and the challenges in implementing that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. I actually wrote a paper about mobile online voting that just came out in the Election Law Journal. So I'm happy to share that with anybody who's interested. So mobile and online voting is not a complete pipe dream. There is mobile and online voting in some places. Canada does it for local elections. Estonia does it for almost all of their elections. I think essentially all of their elections. Everything is online. And the US has been slowly experimenting with some form of mobile and online voting. The first federal election in which anybody could vote online or via mobile device was in 2018 in West Virginia. And it was a pretty small scale rollout. So in 2018, West Virginia, only some counties, about half the counties in West Virginia, opted into this program where they said, if you are a military personnel or living overseas, you can vote via mobile device in this election. And so, so they essentially allowed people to, and we can talk about the logistics of how this works. There's a company that develops a mobile app with the goal of trying to make it easier for people to vote online. You download this app. It takes a photo of you with the goal of trying to, get some biometric information to verify that it really is you who's casting the ballot. And then they say they secure the votes via blockchain technology. So we can talk about blockchain and we can talk about whether that even means anything or not. And they essentially allowed people to vote on a mobile device. And so I wrote a paper on this, and I took advantage of the fact that it was only some counties and not other counties, and it was overseas voters and not everybody. And so you can do kind of a differences in differences design, where you can look at, did participation increase for these people who all of a sudden had mobile voting available to them as an option? And the answer seems to be yes. It looks like mobile voting did actually increase turnout by something like 2 percentage points. So that is arguably a way to get more people voting who previously haven't voted. Maybe especially you're worried about getting young people to participate. Young people are woefully underrepresented in American elections, and maybe the convenience of voting on a mobile device is one policy you might think of as that might get them into the voting population and get them participating at higher rates. Unfortunately, and probably the big elephant in the room to talk about with mobile and online voting, is the security question. Could mobile votes be hacked? And the answer to that question, if you talk to almost any cybersecurity expert, they will tell you yes. they will tell you mobile online votes are not very safe. There was actually a team at MIT that recreated the same system that West Virginia was using, and they showed that, yes, we can hack the votes. We can alter which candidates people purportedly voted for. We can alter who voted. We can create all kinds of mayhem. Now, maybe, if online voting is a small scale kind of thing that's only used in some small elections and relatively low stake settings, maybe nobody is going to bother to spend $1 million and hire a cybersecurity expert to figure out how to hack the election. But if mobile voting is being determining the results of a gubernatorial, congressional race or a presidential race, then yes, absolutely, I think you would need to worry a lot about people hacking the election. And so my gut would tell me that given the state of evidence now, given the state of technology now, mobile voting should probably not be rolled out at a really serious level and be used in a high level election. There are obviously trade-offs there. I think you want higher participation, you want to make it as cheap and easy as possible for people to vote, but the most important thing in a democracy is that people trust the results of elections. And so if elections are easily hackable, you could imagine all kinds of mayhem that could arise, and you can imagine that would be a pretty terrible outcome. So there's lots of complicated things to think about. Is it possible that technology will improve that might in the future make mobile voting more of a possibility? Yes, but the hackers, their technology improves just as much as our technology improves. So there's always going to be this give and take, and I'm nervous about mobile voting personally. If you talk to these cybersecurity experts, funnily enough, the thing they will tell you is the very best voting technology is the really low tech voting technology, which is you fill in a bubble on a piece of paper, or you essentially, they actually think a verifiable paper trail is perhaps the most important thing you can have for safe elections. And one reason is if there is a paper ballot, if something goes wrong, you can always go back and recount the ballots. So even if you're scanning, you might be scanning the paper ballot through a machine, and maybe you're worried that some terrible Russian operative in a basement hacked into that voting machine and screwed up the tally. You can always go back and verify and recount by hand those ballots. And you can also do these, what they call risk limiting audits. So you can pick a random sample of paper ballots and you can count those by hand and make sure that those tallies seem to be matching up with what you're getting from the machines. But it's really nice to have a paper trail, and you don't have that with mobile voting. If I cast my vote on my phone, and then eventually I'm hoping that gets transmitted to the election office, but some hacker intervenes and alters my vote before it gets to the election office, I might have no way of knowing that even happened. The election office doesn't have any way of knowing whether that happened. There's no way of doing an audit ex post to figure out what happened and who really should have won the election. So, so these are all pretty interesting and important things to think about. If you are really interested in these topics, there are lots of people who work on them all the time. There's a big hacker convention called DEF CON that meets in Vegas every summer. And one of the villages at DEF CON is devoted to election security. And so they will actually, it's kind of controversial actually, but these election experts will get together and they will try to see, can we hack into all the voting machines that various states are using right now? One reason it's controversial is, of course, election officials don't want people hacking into their machines and showing how vulnerable the technology is. But on the other hand, they're probably doing a service by helping us figure out where our vulnerabilities are and helping us figure out how to solve those. I see one person, was it Alex? Somebody had a hand up. Questions? Are there, sorry, does anybody have any questions? Or I'm sure I've been missing things on the chat too.
I think one of the questions that we got was just out of curiosity, given all your research about kind of elections as well as COVID-19, what is like the most interesting or surprising finding you found?
Yeah, so I mean, so one surprising finding I would say is that voting by mail appears to not have a clear partisan effect. I know a lot of people suspect that, these kinds of election administration questions tend to be politically very contentious. A lot of people expect that And I've done research on this showing that if we could somehow get everybody voting, at least in the short term, that would probably benefit the Democratic Party, because the people who are less likely to vote are younger people, non-white people, people who don't go to church, lower income people. So, all of the various categories that tend to be a little bit left of center and tend to support the Democratic Party when they have the opportunity. So if anything, you would expect that if we could somehow get everybody voting, that would actually change a lot of things. It would change election results, it would change policy, it would change incentives for politicians and so on. And yet, all male elections, which do increase turnout, don't clearly benefit one side or the other. And so on the one hand, I find that somewhat reassuring, because if you're trying to convince an election administrator, hey, we should really make it easier for people to vote, they're going to be reluctant to do it if they're worried that it's going to have a partisan effect. And if they're worried it's going to benefit one party or the other, that's going to upset half of the politicians that they answer to. So I actually found that to be a fairly surprising result, but in some ways reassuring if your hope was to implement mail voting.
I have a question.
Yes.
So if voting by mail shows it's doesn't show any partisanship, and if everyone voted, you said that more people would vote for Democratic candidates, then does this mean that there are still more people who are not voting who would otherwise have voted for Democrats?
Yes, no, absolutely, yes. I mean, that means that, yes, voting by mail, and this is true for a lot of electoral reforms, it's also true for get out the vote efforts. There is a subset of Americans that, for whatever reason, don't seem to be all that interested in voting, and they are not very responsive to different reforms or different efforts to mobilize them. So yes, absolutely. Voting by mail only increases a couple percent of the American public, and you're probably not getting those really underrepresented groups that we worry are underrepresented in the political process. And that's, why is that? I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting questions, interesting things to talk about there. But the way I think about it is that voting is a collective action problem, right? I individually, we sometimes call this the paradox of voting. What are the chances that any one voter is going to be pivotal in the presidential election? What are the chances that my vote is going to decide whether or not Donald Trump versus Joe Biden is the next president? It's essentially zero, right? I mean, even if you live in Ohio or New Hampshire or Pennsylvania or one of the so-called swing states, it's probably on the order of 1 in 10 million, 1 in 50 million, the chances that your individual vote is going to make a difference for who's president. And so from a purely instrumental, rational perspective, why should I bother to vote? And I think that's right in some sense, right? It's costly for me to vote. I have to travel all the way to the polling place. I have to wait in line. It's a pain. I have to, fill out paperwork and so on. And the odds that my vote actually is pivotal for some really big important election essentially is zero. And so I actually think the bigger mystery is not why are people not voting? It's why are so many people voting to begin with? And I don't think we should sit around, I personally am not of the position that we should chastise people for not voting and say, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you do civic duty? It's completely understandable why people don't vote. And the way we should solve that problem, of course, that does turn out to be very consequential, because it means that there are significant segments of society that are underrepresented in politics. And the way that we normally solve those kinds of collective action problems is to essentially compel people, right? We don't say, it'd be really nice if everybody paid their taxes. Let's send a postcard to everybody's house and encourage them to pay their taxes. We just say, if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to go to jail, right? We compel people legally to pay their taxes. I don't think it would be a crazy thing to compel people legally to vote. And they do this in lots of countries. So Australia is one country where they have what's called a compulsory voting policy, where if you don't vote, you get fined. And the fine is not huge. It's on the order of something like $20. If you have a valid excuse, like you were sick or you were traveling for work or et cetera, you can get out of it. You don't have to pay the fine. But they essentially say it's expected of you as a citizen of Australia to vote in all of our elections. And they get more than 90% of people voting. And actually think that's something that we should seriously consider. And I actually was part of what we called the Universal Voting Group, which was hosted by Brookings and the Harvard Kennedy School. And we essentially wrote a report to that effect, which was just released maybe a few weeks ago, where we said we should be seriously talking about something like compulsory voting, universal civic duty voting in the United States, because voting is a collective action problem. Our society would be better off if everybody voted, but nobody individually has the incentive to turn out and vote.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think kind of in line with getting more people to vote, Vivian asked in the chat, are policymakers considering ways to make registering to vote easier as well in the side of vote?
Yeah, there are some strategies out there to try to make registering easier. Some countries have what you might call automatic registration, where essentially, everyone, the country already knows that you're a citizen, and as soon as you turn 18, you're automatically registered to vote. Automatic registration in the United States is not very feasible because we don't have a big national database of everyone who is eligible to vote. And maybe that's a good thing. I think a lot of people are nervous about government officials having lots of data about them and so on, and maybe that's a good thing. But one downside of that is that it's not easy to just automatically know who's eligible to vote and register them. So registration is a huge part of the problem. A lot of registration is costly. As soon as you turn 18, you have to go fill out paperwork and mail it in. Every time you move, you have to contact your election officials and tell them, oh, I've moved. And young people are obviously more likely to move than older people are. And so that has all kinds of distortionary effects. There are some strategies out there. So Alaska is essentially trying some version of automatic registration. And Alaska is in a good position to do that because they do more or less have a database of all the eligible voters, because in Alaska, as some of you may know, you can get like a check from the government every year. You get basically free money for being a citizen of Alaska. And I don't know the full history of that, but you essentially get some check that's determined by oil revenues. And basically everyone who is eligible signs up to get that check. And so the state of Alaska essentially knows who is a citizen in good standing of Alaska, and they can just automatically register all those people to vote. And so that is one state where they have essentially tried something like that. But most states don't have an option like that. Another option that's out there is what you might call pre-registration, where some of you might already be old enough to pre-register in the states where you live. So some states will allow you to say, starting on your 16th birthday, you can pre-register to vote. So maybe even when you go to the DMV and you get your driver's license, you can say, I'd like to pre-register to vote, which essentially means I'm not eligible yet, but I'd like to essentially fill out the registration paperwork so that on my 18th birthday, I automatically become registered. And I don't have to remember on my 18th birthday that I need to do that paperwork. And so I've written a paper about that and shown that, yes, that does actually increase registration and turnout among young people. Again, the effects aren't huge, but it does help. And so there are things like that people are trying. And I would encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. If you live in a state that allows for pre-registration, when you go in to get your driver's license, just go ahead and pre-register to vote, and you don't have to worry about it when you turn 18. But voter registration is a big challenge in the US because elections are run at the local level. So every time you move, you have to re-register. And administratively, it's a big hassle. When you actually do it, you'll probably find that it's kind of a pain, and you'll wonder why you're doing it. But it's good for our country that you do it.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Which one? So do you think the electoral college is better, or everyone just counting everyone's votes?
Yeah, there's a lot of fun things to talk about there. I have never heard a compelling argument in favor of the electoral college. I can't think of any principled, moral, political economy, any other kind of compelling argument in favor of the electoral college, except that the electoral college was a practical compromise when we were founding the country. In 1788, it wasn't feasible to run a nationwide election and get everyone's votes. So instead, all the states sent electors. And we inherited this very old system that there were practical reasons to do it at the time, but there wasn't really any principled reason to do it at the time. So yes, if, and what are the implications of the Electoral College today? The implications are essentially some people's votes count more than other people's. If you're a presidential candidate, you essentially know, if you're Joe Biden, you essentially know that you've already got California and New York and Illinois locked up. And so why bother to cater to the interests of those states? And you probably also know that Arkansas and Wyoming and Utah and Idaho, those are a foregone conclusion the other way. And so again, why would you bother to cater to those people? You're going to spend all of your time thinking about people in Ohio and Florida and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe, and so on. So it's a pretty small subset of states. And so there's just an inherent inequality there. And if you want everyone's interests to be represented, there's, the Electoral College is obviously harming that. The Electoral College also probably does have partisan implications because it puts bigger weight on smaller states. And smaller states do, on average, tend to be more Republican. So Wyoming gets roughly 3 times the number of electoral votes per person as California. And again, I can't think of any compelling moral reason, moral argument for why that should be the case. That's just the historical precedent that we've adopted and we've stuck with for a long time. So yeah, again, some of you can disagree with me. I can't think of a good defense of the Electoral College. Now, if you actually wanted to change the Electoral College, that would be a really difficult thing to do. And there are different ways of doing it. The obvious way to do it, but the impossible way to do it, would be something like a constitutional amendment. And you're not going to get a constitutional amendment because a bunch of states benefit from the Electoral College. So they're not going to vote in favor of getting rid of it. They like it. So there are other clever ways you could imagine getting rid of the Electoral College. The most clever and the most interesting one is as follows. Every state is allowed to assign their electors however they want. So some states could pass a law that says, Illinois could pass a law that says, instead of giving all of our electoral votes to whoever wins Illinois, we're going to give all of our electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. And suppose enough states did that, now all of a sudden you effectively have the national popular vote determining who wins, even though you still have the Electoral College in principle. So that would be kind of a clever way to get around this. And there is actually a bill going around some states have already passed it, which essentially says, as soon as enough other states have passed this law, we will also essentially abide by this policy, so that as soon as enough states have done this, so that it would be the majority of electoral votes and it would guarantee that the national popular vote winner would win, then we're happy to go ahead and assign all of our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote as opposed to the Electoral College or as opposed to our states. So I think that's a pretty clever solution. As you can imagine, that bill is mostly being passed by large Democratic-leaning states because those are the ones that suffer the most from the Electoral College. So Illinois and California, New York love this idea. Wyoming doesn't like the idea because it hurts their party and it hurts their relative representation. Ohio also doesn't like this idea because Ohio is the belle of the ball, right? And under the current campaign system, and this would weaken their influence. And so, in order to get enough states on board, you can't just get the big Democratic states. You need some other states to sign on. Some smaller Democratic states have done it, but you would need a few Republican states. You would need maybe if Georgia and Texas did it too, because they said, you know what? We also are suffering from the Electoral College. We're not getting our fair representation. If they did it, then you could potentially get there. But they haven't supported it yet. But that's an interesting thing to think about and something to work on if you're interested in politics.
Amazing. I think that's all the time we have today for questions, but can everyone give Dr. Fowler a big round of applause? Thank you so much, Dr. Fowler, for your time. I know the students learned so much.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Good luck to all of you. When you go to college, consider the University of Chicago. You can come meet me in person. We will be back on campus by then, I hope, or some point soon. And I would love to follow up with any of you and talk more about elections if you're interested. So feel free to email me as well. Thank you so much.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, amazing questions, everyone. The last thing that we need people to do is just fill out a survey. Next week's session is mainly going to be the questions that you all have about the coronavirus and the pandemic that you want us to answer, that you might not have had a chance to kind of learn about. So I'm going to be sending this survey in the group chat, but it's really, really important that you fill it out just so Ryan and I get feedback about how the program went overall. If we were to do a program again in the future, what would it look like? And also to get the questions that you guys want. So please fill it out. It's also anonymous, so we won't know, like, if you said something, it's not like we can trace it back to you. We just want to get as much feedback as possible. So I sent it in the group chat, so everyone should have access to it. And I will send it again in an email to all of you, the regular email that we always send out.
So like how many classes? Which classes? I don't know how many. I went to all the classes, but I don't know how many were there.
Yes, okay, so this is the 7th one. And next week is the 8th one, which is our last one, which is why we just want to get all the questions y'all have before next week so we can answer them. And then also just make sure we can get as much feedback as possible. So yes, just please fill that out. You can do it on your own time. We just wanted to also build in time in case like you can just do it now, because I know that we always procrastinate. We say we're going to do something, but then it just never comes around. So we're just going to keep the Zoom call open until 4:30. So you have until like 4:30-ish just to kind of fill it out. It's not very long, to be honest. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, you can always ask too.
It asks